Hello, welcome to my channel. In today's topic, we will be discussing percents. So first, let's understand what percents are. Percents are comparing an amount to 100. Now, how do we convert to percents? When we're changing fractions to percents, there are two different ways to solve them. First, you can divide the fraction and move the decimal point over to the right 2 times, then add your percent sign. Or you can compare the fraction to 100. I have given an example of how to do both of those methods. The first one is dividing the fraction. So my fraction is 2/5, so I must divide the 5 into the 2. Since 5 does not go into 2, we put a 0 above the 2. Next to the 2, we now add a decimal point and a 0. The decimal point that we added, we now have to move that above the fraction line as well. Now we must see how many times 5 can go into 20. Well, 5 can go into 20 4 times. So we write our 4 above our division bar, and 5 times 4 is 20. So then we subtract 20 from 20, which equals 0. Our answer is 0.4. Well, remember, we must move our decimal point to the right 2 times. When we move that decimal point over to the right 2 times, we end up with 40, and don't forget the percent sign, we end up with 40%. Now let's try the second method by comparing the fraction to 100. So we have the same fraction, 2/5, equals, we have a question mark, and then in the numerator and in the denominator we put 100 because we're comparing it to 100. So we must figure out 5 times what number gives me 100? Well, 5 times 20 gives me 100. So if I had to multiply by 20 in my denominator, I must do the exact same thing in my numerator. I will multiply whatever number is in my numerator by the same number. So for this problem, we have 2 in our numerator. So we will multiply 2 times 20 to see what that answer is. 2 times 20 is 40. So my answer is 40 over 100. 40 over 100 equals 40%, which is the same answer when we divided the fraction, which lets me know that 40% is the correct answer because we got the same answer doing both methods. Now, changing decimals to percents, there's only one way to solve that. All you do is move the decimal point over 2 times to the right and add your percent sign. I have given a few examples below, so let's look at them. We have 0.20. If I move my decimal point over to the right 2 times, that equals 20%. My next example is 0.5. When I move my decimal point over 2 places to the right, the first place is behind the 5. The next place is an empty space. In that empty space, you must fill it with a 0. So 0.5 becomes 50% when we move it over 2 places to the right. My last example is 1.4. As we notice, the decimal point is between the 1 and the 4. You still must move your decimal point 2 places to the right. The first time I move it, it is behind the 4. The next time I move it, it is an empty space. Remember, we must fill the empty space with a 0. So your final answer for 1.4 is 140%. Now that we have learned what to do, now we can put those rules into practice. We will start with our fraction 3/4. And remember, there are two ways to find the percent to a fraction. We can divide the fraction or we can compare it to 100. So we will start with dividing the fraction. So we will divide the 4 into the 3. Well, remember, 4 just cannot go into 3. So we will have a 0 above the 3. We will add a decimal point before we can add a 0. So add your decimal point, then add a 0. And now we will see how many times 4 can go into 30. And also, don't forget to move that decimal point up as well above your division bar line. 4 goes into 30 7 times. Then we multiply, we just do regular division. We multiply 4 times 7. 4 times 7 is 28. We will subtract the 28 from the 30. 30 take away 28 leaves us with 2. So we can't be left with anything, so we need to add another 0 and bring it down. Now we see how many times does 4 go into 20. Well, 4 goes into 20 5 times. That 5 goes above your division bar line. 5 times 4 is 20. 20 minus 20 is 0. So we're left with 0.75 as our answer. But remember, you must move the decimal point over 2 times so that we can make it a percent. If we move the decimal point over 2 times, our answer is, that's 1, that's 2, 75%. Now that is the first method. Let's try comparing 3/4 to 100. If we have 3/4 equals 100 always goes in the denominator. The numerator is left blank because we're trying to figure out how many times that is. So 4 times what gives me 100? Well, 4 times 25 gives me 100. Well, remember, if we multiply by 25 in the denominator, we must do the same thing in the numerator to find that answer. So 3 times 25 is 75. So my answer is 75 over 100, and that equals 75%, which is the exact same answer we had when we completed it the first time by dividing the fraction. So 75% is the correct answer. Now let's look at our second fraction, 2/5. If we use our first method of dividing, we will divide the 5 into the 2. Well, 5 can't go into 2, so we must put a 0 above the 2. And because we have no more numbers, but we need to add more numbers, we must add a decimal point behind the 2 and a 0. Don't forget to move that decimal point up above your division bar line as well. Now we must see how many times does 5 go into 20. Well, 5 goes into 20 4 times. Now we multiply 4 times 5, which is 20. 20 minus 20 is 0. Our answer is 0.4. But remember, we must move the decimal point over 2 times. When we move it over 2 times, we have an empty space. Remember, we fill all empty spaces with a 0. So our answer is 40%. Okay. If we do it the second way, which is comparing 2/5 to 100, remember our numerator is left blank until we find that answer. The 100 is in your denominator. So we see how many times does it take for us to get from 5 to 100? Or 5 times what gives me 100? So 5 times 20 gives me 100. So if I multiply by 20 in my denominator, I must do the same thing in my numerator. So 2 times 20 is what? 40. 40 divided by 100 is 40%, which is the same answer we had when we divided the fraction as well. So 40% is my answer. Now, remember, when we solve for converting decimals to percents, we only move the decimal point over 2 times to the right. So if I move my decimal point 2 times to the right in 0.06, 1, 2, you will drop those zeros in front of the 6, and your answer is simply 6%. For my next problem, 0.4, if I move my decimal point over 2 times to the right, the first time I move it, it's behind the 4. The next time I move it, it's an empty space. Remember, we fill all empty spaces with a 0. So 0.4 equals 40%. For my next problem, 0.85, if I move my decimal point over 2 places to the right, the first time I move it is behind the 8. The next time I move it is behind the 5. My answer is 85%. My last problem is 1.25. I still have to move my decimal point over 2 times to the right. The first time I move it is behind the 2. The next time I move it is behind the 5. We must keep that 1. So my answer is 125%.